Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Moclips Races. Hello there. The roar of high-powered motor cars around the famous track at Indianapolis today is a far cry from the races back in 1910. But probably the biggest and most exciting automobile ever staged on Grays Harbor, and the one that comes the nearest to matching the famous Indianapolis Classic, is the 4th of July race at Moclips in 1910. Oh, it was important, all right. All the Northwest waited for a report of the race over the sands of the North Beach on that long-ago day. And the report, well, it was something that was not anticipated, and something that made history long remembered on Grays Harbor. So tonight, on the day when the nation has traditionally listened for the reports from Indianapolis, and when thousands have cheered as the gasoline buggies have roared around the lamented oval, we open our scrapbook to a story of Grays Harbor's biggest racing event and its strange climax. But here, to take a few seconds that we always provide for our sponsor, is Dick Crombie, Johnny on the spot with a pertinent comment about something of interest. Dick? The horseless carriage had become the automobile by the time 1910 rolled around on Grays Harbor. And there were enough of those snorting gasoline-burning marvels on the roads and streets to make the town pretty conscious that a new age was at hand. Moreover, there was a road down from Montesano, and if you were intrepid and had plenty of time, you could motor up to Monte, or for that matter of fact, down to Moclips and enjoy the refreshing experience of zooming along at 20 to 25 miles per hour in your own gasoline car. No, the automobile was not a commonplace in 1910, but it had proven itself, and drivers were no longer greeted with salutations, "Get a horse," when they went by for a drive. Now, with the advent of the highway to Moclips, a rattling planked road with occasional turnouts that touched the sand of the Pacific beach, and was Grays Harbor's first contact overland with the ocean, automobiling on the beach became quite a sport. Motorists who wanted to test the mettle of their cars drove them to the beach and pushed the throttle down as far as it would go, or as far as they dared, which was more often the case. And safe on the smooth sand of the wide beach, a car would roar at an unbelievable speeds of 40 to 50 miles an hour. A few motorists from Seattle and Tacoma made the trip and tested their cars in the sand. And in May 1910, Grays Harbor decided that it was time to promote a full-scale motorcade to the beach to capitalize on what was apparently one of the harbor's greatest assets, its ocean beach racing. Now, let's mention right here that there was then, as now, a strong rivalry between North and South beaches. The railroad had brought tourists and hotels to the North beaches up as far as Moclips and Roosevelt Beach, and the riverboat had built up Westport on the South beaches. Now, the highway threatened to throw the balance to the North beaches, but the south side of the harbor was keeping up its fight. So when Aberdeen motorists organized a club and invited other car owners in the county to join in, there was talk of a big Northwest meeting of drivers on the beach to Seattle, and to settle the question of the fastest cars and to make it a Roman holiday. And of course, they had to settle the issue of whether it would be on the North or the South beaches. And after much discussion, it was decided to hold two big meetings, one at Moclips on July 4th, 1910, and the other at Cohasset on July 10th, 1910. A Grays Harbor County Motor Car Club was formed W.J. Patterson of Aberdeen was elected president, with A.H. Griffin, the club's other members, from Aberdeen. Bob Little and Art Payne were invited to join from Hoquiam. G.W. Niemeyer and W.H. Abel represented Montesano. Joe Vance, Elma, and Neil Cooney, Cosmopolis. A.L. Davenport of Aberdeen was named as the secretary and treasurer. With this as a nucleus, every car owner in the county was invited in, and the plans developed. First, they decided they would interest Seattle to represent the club in the metropolis and to organize a motorcade to come down for the race of the Glorious Fourth. The club obtained the services of A. Warren Gould. Then, for weeks, the papers were filled with the news of the big event that were to follow. The names of Barney Oldfield and De Palma, Christie, Robertson, and Strang were bantered about as possible entrants in the pot of gold race for the harbor beaches. But although they may have been invited, none of them elected to race down and show up. However, on the 3rd of July dawned, word came down from Seattle that a caravan of 100 cars had left that city headed by Warren Gould on their way to Grace Harbor. They were expected to be in Aberdeen before night, and sure enough, as the day wore on, the telegraph ticked in the Aberdeen railway station reported the cavalcade moving through Olympia, then Elma, and finally Montesano. As they passed through the towns en route, banners were stretched across the streets to welcome them, and the citizens lined the route to watch the roaring vehicles kick up clouds of dust and roll on towards Aberdeen and Hoquiam. They began to pass over the Heron Street Bridge about 4 in the afternoon, and the hotels of Aberdeen and Hoquiam were soon jammed, and all garages facilities were full, of which there were few, were taxed to capacity. To test the conditions of the beach, Jim Hackett had taken his Palmer Singer to Moclips first and then to Cohasset and opened it up wide. The car had reeled off a breathtaking 74 miles per hour before it blew a tire and ended the test. Cohasset was found to have the best beach for motoring, in the opinion of the committee. But because of the keen rivalry, both beaches were to have their day equally in the sun. Well, the cars that had stayed in Hoquiam and Aberdeen on the eve of the 4th pushed off for the beaches early, and the road rumbled to its line of traffic heading west. At nearly every other turnout, there was a car drawn off to the side to permit its owner to make repairs. But by noon, the motorcade, reinforced with a dozen cars from Grays Harbor entrance, had arrived at the beach. The committee was already on hand, and everything was ready for the event. There was a 2-mile race for cars of 20 horsepower and under, a 5-mile race for cars of 20 to 40 horsepower. There was a special 10-mile race and a race for cars with more than 50 horsepower. In all, there were 8 contests lined up. The crowd, which had gone down on a special train leaving Montesano early and picking up excursionists in Aberdeen and Hoquiam, soon selected its favorites. The local cars were, of course, prime choices, but everyone marveled at the 80-horsepower giant from Seattle that seemed too powerful for anyone to even hope to beat in a free-for-all race. And, a few at a time, the cars rolled out and lined up for the go signal. At the flag, they were off, their goggle drivers crouching over the wheels, the engines throbbing and roaring, for none of the cars had mufflers, and streaks of flames jetting from the engines. Cars were raced without hoods to keep the engines cool, and a newspaper reporter the sounds of the motors like a roaring of musketry. Well, as the cars qualified to enter in one race were making their run, the rest of the motorists tried to keep their engines warm and in tune. They drove around behind the dunes and occasionally got in the wrong place. Driving a car in the sand was new to most of them, and as many were stuck as there were on the beach racing. And for the motorist who expected to enter the race, getting stuck was serious business. Several Moclips residents got out their horses and made a business of hauling cars out of the sand. One motorist got over his depth in salt water and his car stalled. The tide came in and he had to abandon it to the sea. Others managed to rescue their cars just in time. And in all the planning for the races, little consideration was given to time. The tide, which waits for no man, began to come in. And it was a high tide too. And each event was run off. And the cars had to start higher and higher on the beach or else run into the surf. More of them were stuck. Some of the surf were the flying spray wet down their engines, and others in the soft sand higher on the beach. By this time, teams of men were ganging together to push a car out of the 5 spot, and the motorists, without a hefty roll of bills, were sorely put to keep their cars from rolling. And by the time the tide had entirely engulfed the firm portion of the beach, nearly every car at Moclips was mired in the soft sand. Teams were tugging, gangs were pushing, and cars were bogged down in the salt water over their wheels. The press car, with representatives from Seattle Times and the PI, dashed about as long as it could, trying to get impressions of the disaster, but finally it too bogged down, and one by one the cars were routed out across the sand, pushed or towed, and gotten back onto firm soil of the highway. To make matters worse, some of the enterprising gangs who were charging for their service stationed men along the beach to direct the motorist into soft sand and then collect for pulling them out. Only 5 of the 8 contestants had been run off when the officials declared the race off, and all efforts were turned to salvage. But in spite of every effort, Charles Patton lost his car in the ocean, and many others were pulled out only with the greatest cooperation from motorists, teamsters, and spectators. And incidentally, many of the spectators were now shoeless, their trousers rolled up above their knees, helping to salvage the cars. It was a bedraggled line of cars that sputtered back over the plank roads that night towards Hoquiam. Some were towing others, but the beach was lined with machines that had been washed out, or, like one Hoquiam resident, broke an axle in the soft sand. And the Seattle papers were filled with blasts of vitriol aimed at the residents of Moclips, who were blamed for the whole affair, including the actions of the tide and the conditions of the soft sand. And now, Dick Crombie, a few words from our sponsor. Yes, that was the famous 4th of July automobile race at Moclips. And incidentally, it was the last major racing event in that town. For one thing, the sea moved in the next year to wreck the buildings, and a fire followed a year later to burn much of the town, which Seattle held as vengeance for the treatment that its motorists had received at the hands of the community. The Cohasset race were called off because no cars would come down from Seattle, and it was several years before anything resembling an automobile race was promoted by local motorists. But as for that, the motorists were having their troubles right here in town. Aberdeen police arrested Kenneth Hayes, Ellis Martin, Frank Engel, and J.S. Phillips for driving their cars in excess of the town speed limit, and the motorists rallied to the cause to get the speed limit increased. You can't drive a car that slow and not ruin the engine, they told the judge. But people were dismayed when the city lifted its speed limit to a new high. People won't be safe on the street, they told each other. The old speed limit, 8 miles per hour, was fast enough. It was the day of the gasoline buggy, as we find it here in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.